So it's not just private schools. It's any diminishment of public sector responsibility and control of education, as well as the increased use of business and managerial models in education, which is where merit pay fits in. This is a private sector model. Privatization, in this broad sense, arises out of a neoliberal perspective which advocates cutting back government generally and placing a greater reliance on market mechanisms. Liberals and progressives, on the other hand, including myself, see this neoliberal argument or this conservative argument as not based on evidence, as ideological. Evidence is manufactured to support this perspective. My paper is about the details of this debate. In this paper, I discuss 3 directions in neoliberal thinking about education. One is cost recovery. The second is the expansion of private schooling. And the other are managerial models. I talk about that as output-based aid or outcomes-based education, which is a long history. And I'll get to merit pay when I talk about managerial models. But I'm going to start by going through this issue of cost recovery briefly, privatization briefly, and then get to managerial models. When I repeat that, this merit pay is part of a package of reforms, and this is the package. Some of my points will be about the US and some will be about other countries. Cost recovery. During the liberal era of the 60s and 70s, education was generally assumed to be a public responsibility. And that financing for education, improvements in access and quality, would come from public financing. Things like progressive income taxes, we talked about on a regular basis. Cost recovery is the ubiquitous term of the neoliberal era, signifying the desire to substitute private financing for public. In this section, I talk about what economists call user fees, which is tuition charges for education. User fees more broadly in the public sector, user fees for park, user fees for health clinics, user fees for education. There's, in the US, the user fees have mostly been increased tuition at higher education levels. In developing countries, they started charging for primary school. They started charging poor people to go to primary school, which, as you can imagine, cuts some poor people out of the mix, just as it does in this country. Cuts some poor people out of the higher education access as the tuition fees go up and as scholarships don't keep pace. The principal rationale for these user fees was this idea of a budget constraint. That it was either impossible or inadvisable to raise taxes anymore. This is the hallmark of the neoliberal era. Was, you know, Bush Sr. on his campaign trail said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." The idea is we can't tax anymore. In the paper, I talk about how this was completely invented in the Reagan-Thatcher era. The Reagan-Thatcher era is what brought us globally to neoliberalism. Blame Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. They were part of a tide that was changing around the globe. They were in the forefront of that time. In the paper, I talk about how this budget constraint is lousy economics, even from a neoliberal perspective. Economics tells us to raise taxes when the public sector has good investment opportunities. If education is a good investment, then we should be raising taxes to finance education. Anyway, I talk more in the paper about cost recovery. I just wanted to mention it here. But that's part of the privatization package. Let me go on to the second area, privatization and vouchers. A central feature of 2 decades of neoliberal policies has been the transfer of government activities to the private sector. Most evidence on the impact of privatization of primary and secondary education comes from wealthy countries like the U.S. Some information is now available from developing countries. In the paper, I discuss evidence from both. I'll just stick to the U.S. evidence here. I'll mention something about the international evidence. Despite 25 years of rhetoric, there is no credible evidence that private schools perform better in increasing student achievement than public schools. At first, this may seem counterintuitive because we observe that kids who go to private schools, on average, score higher on tests, on standardized tests than the kids in public schools. Not all public schools, not all private schools, but on average. However, this is because in the U.S., private schools have a much more advantaged student body. Research that tries to control for the differences in students comes to the conclusion that private schools don't do any better, and as well as in qualitative studies, private schools don't do any better than public schools with similar students. Also, assuming they have similar resources. Some private schools have more resources than public schools. And the public policy question is not whether students in existing private schools perform better, but whether equivalent students would benefit more from private schools than public schools with similar resources. And the conclusion in the U.S. literature is they would not. Students do equally well in public and private schools. There are some experiments with voucher schemes in the U.S. There are voucher schemes in Milwaukee, Cleveland, Dayton, New York, Washington, D.C. So in a few places there have been experiments with vouchers. A key part of the rationale for vouchers is based on what I just said was false, that private schools do better than public schools. Proponents also argue that competition among schools and market discipline will lead schools to be more innovative and responsive. Studies of the nature of educational processes in existing public and private schools do not uphold this assumption either. And the test score studies, when they're done by people who are advocates of vouchers, show that voucher schools, students' achievement is higher. And when they're done by other researchers who are not particularly advocates of vouchers, you find that there's no significant difference in achievement.